Good morning. This is Reverend Rebecca Simon Peter with Spiritual Mojo. And I'm the author of Dreamland Jesus, and I'm here to talk with you about uplifting your spirit, upleveling your faith, and upholding your consciousness. That's what Spiritual Mojo is all about, and we need it. We always need spiritual mojo. So I want to start with a word from the scriptures. This is from Psalm chapter 30, verse 5. You'll probably recognize it. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. Say that with me. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. That's a really terrific scripture to have tucked in your pocket, tucked in your mind when things are tough. In many ways, even as the pandemic is raging around us, more than 2.1 million deaths worldwide, and we've topped 400,000 in the United States, it does feel like morning is coming, doesn't it? It does feel like morning is coming. We've finally had a peaceful transfer of power with the presidency. We've got African American, Indian American female vice president. We had a lovely inauguration with an incredible youth poet laureate. A lot of, you can feel the raising of the vibration from a place of chaos, especially with the Capitol riots on January 6th to this peaceful transfer of power. It feels like joy is coming. The pandemic's still raging. We still don't have enough vaccines, but we've got people that are really attending to it from a science-based place. That gives me a sense of joy. So in the chat, love to see if you were at the inauguration. Were you there? I wasn't there, but I watched and I watched later, and it was really quite uplifting. Also, would love to know how you are being impacted by the pandemic. Have there been people in your life, in your congregation, in your family, in your neighborhood that have contracted the virus? Have they passed away? Tough stuff. And I want you to know that my heart goes out to you. There have been so many losses for us personally, relationally, nationally, internationally through the pandemic. And yet, I'm here to talk to you about how joy does come in the morning. And by golly, we may be approaching morning soon. I want to share with you, I did some research this week for a webinar that I taught, and I thought this stuff was so interesting. I taught a webinar for Market Square Books, post-pandemic normal for churches, how to inspire people to move forward in uncertain times. But I thought the information was so interesting that I wanted to save it and share it with you folks today as well. So I want to talk with you about pandemics push us to progress, to make progress. Pandemics push progress. It's very, very interesting. Historically, pandemics, epidemics, catastrophes have meant big leaps forward because it shows us our weak spots. You know, when you've got everybody, whatever that's, like in a country or a community or a city, but when everybody, quote, gets sick and everybody is impacted, you can really see where the stress points in the system are. And you can really see, wow, where do we need to up our game? Where do we need to fix things? What sort of progress can we make? And then there's the kinds of progress that are made not because we're seeing the weak points, but because people are sequestered or people are impacted in various ways, and their environment changes, which changes their internal environment in their mind and in their spirit, and then something new comes out of it. I've seen the weak spots in my own life during the pandemic. I saw that much as I love to travel and travel all over the country, sometimes outside of the country to do my work with creating a culture of renewal, to see family, sometimes to vacation, as much as I loved that, and I did, that was killing me. That was really wearing me out. And that was a weak spot in my schedule, the way that I had my life organized. Now I'm able to connect in just like you in so many ways with people, again, all over the country and the world without leaving my home. That was a fix that needed to happen. I also saw that because I was traveling so much, I was actually working a lot more than was really healthy. And that also has been adjusted because now I am able to take a little more time off, like a real weekend, a real couple of days off, And that's been really delightful. I saw a weak spot in my relation to my family, not seeing them enough. And as I've mentioned on here many times, doing family Zoom meetings Sunday mornings right before Spiritual Mojo has been incredible. We've done a surprise anniversary for my parents, a surprise birthday party for my mom with people from all over the country. We never would have thought of that before. I know you've got stories like that too. You may have grieved together online with things. In fact, I attended a ALS support meeting for my mom. She's got ALS with my mom, my dad, my sister was there. 3 different states. We were all there, and experiencing feelings and dealing with life on life's terms. So the pandemic has shown us individually our weak spots, but also undoubtedly it's shown us societally and internationally our weak spots. We've seen that, oh my gosh, people of color are being impacted disproportionately. Why? They're on the front lines of things. Healthcare is not as good. Access to healthcare is not as even. Access to good food is not as even. And so we're just seeing, we've known this, but we're seeing it in stark relief. Like, wow, here are the people that are serving us food, and some of the frontline sort of jobs in restaurants and things like that tend to be disproportionately people of color. So a strong impact. We're seeing that. We're seeing people that don't have food. We're seeing all kinds of stresses on the system. So it's not just us, though, that's seeing that. That's the sort of thing that has been noticed time and time again, what the weak spots are in a system when there have been pandemics and epidemics and just, big sort of catastrophes. Well, I want to focus on 5 really interesting pieces of history and the progress that the pandemic or the epidemic has pushed us to. So let's start way back when. We're going to go all the way back to the 1300s. In the 14th century, there was the Black Death. Okay, the Black Death, and it wiped out, significant death toll. 60% of Europe wiped out in the Black Death. This was no small plague, and it wasn't just like a one-time thing. This was before vaccines, it was before all that, and so it would pop up here and it would pop up there, and it was several centuries of living with the Black Plague. But here's some really cool stuff that came out of the Black Plague: better living and working conditions for the poor. Public sanitation became a thing. People like, oh, we really shouldn't have sewage running in the middle of the streets. We really need to do a better job with this. In fact, out of the Black Plague and the many ways that it impacted people over the decades and the centuries came the creation of the middle class. And that was one of the results of this better living and working conditions for the poor. So we don't just go through these things and say, thank God that's over. We actually learn from them, and we make important changes that advance the human spirit, that advance the creation, and that advance our knowledge so that we can be people who make progress. Now, secondly, the 1918 flu pandemic. We've heard a lot about that during the pandemic, that there was a pandemic 100 years ago. Yep. So the 1918, you know what came about as a result of that? Public health policies improved. Public health policies improved to prevent illness, not just deal with, oh gosh, we should have masks or quarantine, but to prevent illness. And that's where childhood vaccines, first started to come about. There'd been work that had been done in the previous century, but it was this long, slow process to get us to the point of vaccines. Well, basically, what's been wiped out since then? Smallpox. I got measles, mumps, rubella when I was a kid. Those vaccines. I don't know about you, but it was just sort of a matter of course. And so there are all sorts of childhood diseases that people just don't get anymore because of the vaccine. In fact, during the time of smallpox, people wouldn't even name their kids unless they survived smallpox, because it was such a devastating epidemic. And we don't do that anymore. Most people feel pretty safe to name their kids. They don't have to worry about them getting through the smallpox first. All right. Other outbreaks of the plague in the 16th and 17th centuries. I told you that it lasted for centuries. Well, one of the things that it did, you'll recognize this, is it led to the shutting down of theaters, just like we've experienced. Broadway's not open. Many movie theaters are not open. Well, back then, it was one of the main forms of entertainment for all classes of people, 16th and 17th centuries. Guess what happened as a result? Shakespeare could no longer go to the theater and do his works there. Instead, he was sequestered and began to write poetry. Some of his very best works came out of this quarantine when the theaters shut down. He was forced to redirect his creative energies and flowered during that time. Much of the work of Shakespeare we owe to the unfortunate circumstance of those outbreaks in the theater shutting down. Well, not only that, Isaac Newton, you'll remember him, he told us about the theory of gravity. Isaac Newton had to flee to the countryside. He left the city. This was in London. He left the city. And when he went to the countryside, during that period of time, that's where he came up with his theories on calculus. Yes, thank Isaac Newton for calculus, optics, the laws of motion, and gravity. We actually have an epidemic to thank for those amazing advances in science. Well, interestingly enough, if we go to the yellow fever epidemic, this was in Philadelphia in the 18th century, so many of our founding fathers were still alive. But during that yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia, that's when the founding fathers decided that government should actually help bear the responsibility for the health of its citizens. I thought that was so interesting because we're having debates now. Should government be involved with the health of citizens? Should there be mass vaccinations? Does the government have the right to require a mask mandate or things like that? Well, going all the way back to that yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia, there's actually a long history for this great sense of responsibility that our founding fathers and our government had to protect the welfare and the well-being of citizenry. I thought that was very interesting. Now, here comes the most interesting one of all, I think. This came about through various epidemics in the United States that social distancing actually was built into architecture and fashion. Social distancing built into the way our buildings are constructed and even the fashion. Let me give you some examples. So, apartment buildings. They used to be very crowded affairs, one bathroom for all the people on a certain floor. As a result, probably of the 1918 pandemic, apartment buildings now had new codes. The hallways had to be at least 3 feet wide. There could not be shared bathrooms, and fire escapes became a thing because what they realized is with people living right on top of each other like that, that's how stuff spreads. And so social distancing actually is part of our architecture. Now, I wonder if that's true in single home residences as well. I'm not really sure about that. But here's another interesting fact. You know, this old fashioned way that women used to dress with those big hoop skirts? Guess what? Social distancing built right into the clothing of the woman because it gave her distance from the people around her. Now, why there weren't hoop ties or something for men, I don't know. But hoop skirts for women, social distancing built right into fashion. Very interesting. We have made leaps forward. It's pushed us. Now, I'm not sure that the hoop skirt ended up being, this long time leap forward for women, but the fact that it was a means of social distancing, I'm sure was a tremendous relief for women at the time. The point is that pandemics, epidemics, catastrophes prompt us, they push us to make progress. There's an upside even in this pandemic. So let's take a look at where we're at right now. On the one hand, a tremendous loss of life. This 400,000 people in the US alone, we have the largest death toll in the world from this pandemic. More US lives lost than were lost in all of World War II among US troops. Wow, that's really kind of sobering. On the other hand, there's some cool things that are happening. It's got our attention. Lightning speed development of not one, not two, but at least three vaccine developments that are going to be useful and worthy of us using during this pandemic. The lightning speed with which it's happened. People went to work almost immediately on decoding the genome, in the sequencing of the virus and the different variants, and they went to work on vaccines. Now, African American bishop told me this. I haven't had a chance to look it up and find out the name of this person, but apparently the new technology with this vaccine, mRNA, using messenger RNA to carry the vaccine, was made possible by an African American female scientist. This delivery, this technology. So pretty darn cool. Lots of advances. So on the one hand, let's take a look at another like pro and con or downside of the pandemic and upside. On the one hand, we've had the murder of George Floyd and all those very um, catastrophic deaths of innocent Black people. Um, we've had the exposure of systemic racism and the mainstreaming of white supremacy that's happened, certainly happened more than just over this last summer, but we've really seen it in a powerful way where you just couldn't ignore it. Plus frontline workers being people of color, the American people just busting out to read about and get very, very educated in systemic racism and all sorts of efforts to overturn that and to transform that now. I'm most familiar with the institution of the United Methodist Church, and I see everywhere annual conferences are taking on initiatives to expose, to educate, to heal, and to transform the systemic racism that's been so prevalent, if not hidden, in those systems. Okay, so there's all that, right? But on the other hand, what do we also have? The emergence of Kamala Harris as the first female and woman of color elected to national office. I wonder if those are connected. I don't know. But it's certainly a beautiful juxtaposition to see this emergence of the America I have known and loved, the reemergence of that America as we see persons of color breaking barriers. Let's break down systemic racism and let's just open up the table for everyone. A more equitable, a more just society, and that's a beautiful feature that we are seeing right now. So, in the end, what will this pandemic be remembered for? I don't exactly know. We can't know right now what it's going to be remembered for, but we can point out some of the points of progress that are being made as a result of the pandemic. Surely there are things that have happened in your life, some of which have been very difficult, some of which have been absolutely lovely, and you will never forget the highs and the lows. But when we look back, when history looks back on this period of time, what will be remembered exactly? We don't exactly know, but even so, we can still see the points of progress. And I encourage you to keep your heart open and to keep your spirit open, even as you are experiencing the downside, even as you're experiencing isolation, even as you may have experienced COVID or the loss of loved ones. Keep your heart open to how God is also moving through this to bring about progress, to bring about joy, to bring about connection, to bring about a deepening of our souls. And so that's the spiritual mojo for the word of the day. Pandemics push us towards progress individually, communally, and as a society. I do encourage you to put some comments there in the comment section to let me know and to let the rest of us know how you're being impacted and what you think you'll remember from this pandemic. And if you have liked this video, please hit the little like and put a heart there. Share it on your own Facebook page so that the people who are connected to you can have a word of spiritual mojo and a positive word to entertain on this day. And do stay tuned to our website, RebeccaSimonPeter.com, where we're going to have new things coming out all year long. You can also see old spiritual mojos and watch videos from our Uncomfortable Conversation series about systemic racism and faith, democracy, faith, and the common good, in which we explored pre- and post-election themes and the many ways that we are staying connected to you and relevant to what is happening in the world, bringing in the faith perspective, the spiritual mojo. That's the word for today. I look forward to seeing you next week. God bless you. Go be a light in the world. Be that light that our poet laureate spoke to us about last week. Take care.